Baton Rouge, Louisiana, summer 2014. The summer heat in Baton Rouge felt like a heavy blanket, smothering the city and making even the most patient people short-tempered. In the Garden District, where grand homes with manicured lawns whispered of old money and success, the Thornton house stood proud. To everyone on the outside, James and Rebecca Thornton were living a dream. They had it all: a flourishing business, a stunning home, and a marriage that had lasted more than a decade. But inside the house, things weren't as perfect as they seemed. James Thornton was a man who seemed to have it all together. At 38, his charm and confidence had helped him build a thriving business. Yet despite his success, he felt trapped. The constant grind of work and the predictable rhythms of his marriage made him restless. Rebecca, his wife, was admired by everyone. She was graceful, poised, and always seemed in control. She managed their home with care and was the perfect hostess at every event. But behind her composed exterior, Rebecca was beginning to sense that something was wrong. She could feel James pulling away. The warmth in their marriage was fading, and while she tried to ignore the signs, a quiet fear gnawed at her heart. Everything changed when Rebecca's younger sister Sarah moved in. At 27, Sarah was everything Rebecca used to be: vibrant, carefree, and full of energy. She had just left a string of bad relationships behind and needed a fresh start. Rebecca, wanting to help, didn't think twice about inviting her into their home. From the moment Sarah arrived, the atmosphere in the Thornton household shifted. Her laughter echoed through the house, her carefree attitude lighting up every room she entered. Rebecca thought she was helping her sister rebuild her life, but she didn't notice how James's attention had begun to drift. Sarah's youth and spontaneity were a sharp contrast to Rebecca's steady and composed nature. James couldn't help but notice. At first, it was innocent. He found her refreshing, a reminder of the excitement and passion he felt his life was missing. But as the days grew hotter, so did the tension between them. Rebecca had no idea that the kindness she had shown her sister would be the spark that ignited the destruction of everything she held dear. The perfect image of the Thornton family was about to crumble, and none of them could see the storm that was about to engulf their lives. From the moment Sarah stepped into their home, James couldn't take his eyes off her. She wasn't just attractive, she was captivating. Her laughter filled the house in a way that felt almost magical. Everything about her was free-spirited and spontaneous, the complete opposite of the steady and predictable life James shared with Rebecca. At first, James told himself it was harmless. He chalked it up to admiration, a passing thought he could brush aside. But the more time he spent around Sarah, the harder it became to ignore the pull he felt toward her. It started with small moments: shared jokes at the breakfast table, the way her smile lit up the room, and the occasional glance that lingered too long. Sarah noticed his attention. She saw how his gaze would follow her when he thought no one else was watching, how his voice softened whenever he spoke to her. She didn't pull away from it. In truth, she enjoyed it. Sarah, always seeking validation and affection, felt a spark of excitement knowing she had caught James's eye. One hot summer evening, Rebecca had gone out to run errands, leaving James and Sarah alone in the house. The air was still and heavy, almost mirroring the unspoken tension between them. They sat in the living room, chatting about nothing in particular, but every word seemed loaded with something deeper. When James reached out to brush a strand of hair from Sarah's face, the touch was light, almost hesitant, but it sent a jolt through both of them. They locked eyes, and before either of them could think, James leaned in and kissed her. The kiss was brief, but it felt electric. Sarah pulled back slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "We shouldn't do this," she said, though she didn't move away. That single kiss opened a floodgate neither of them could close. What started as a stolen moment became something much bigger. They began meeting in secret, each encounter more reckless than the last. James would invent excuses to leave work early or stay out late, all so he could be with Sarah. At first, they were cautious, finding hidden corners of the house while Rebecca slept, or sneaking out to secluded spots around the city. They would meet in cheap motels or by the quiet banks of the Mississippi River, where they could lose themselves in each other, away from prying eyes. For James, Sarah reignited a fire he hadn't felt in years. With her, he felt alive, energized and free from the routine that had dulled his marriage. For Sarah, the affair gave her a sense of power and significance she hadn't experienced before. But the more they fed their desire, the riskier their actions became. James began lying to Rebecca with ease, claiming late-night meetings or unexpected work trips. Sarah, who had once been carefree and open with her sister, grew distant and evasive. Rebecca, always observant, began to notice the changes. James's absences became too frequent to ignore, and his once affectionate demeanor turned cold and detached. Sarah's behavior shifted too. She was less bubbly, more guarded. The bond the sisters once shared started to feel strained. The affair, fueled by secrecy and forbidden passion, was spiraling out of control. James and Sarah were too caught up in each other to see the cracks they were leaving in their lives. It wasn't just their actions that would catch up with them, it was the truth waiting to come crashing down, ready to destroy everything in its path. Rebecca Thornton was no stranger to the small shifts in life. She noticed the tiniest changes, the things other people might brush off. And lately, there were too many changes to ignore. Her husband, James, had been acting differently. He avoided her eyes when they talked, and his touch, once comforting and warm, now felt distant and cold. He came home later than usual, always with an excuse: work meetings, traffic, errands. But the excuses didn't add up. And then there was Sarah, Rebecca's younger sister. Sarah had always been full of life, her laughter filling any room they walked into. But now her behavior seemed off. She was quieter, her movements more cautious. She avoided Rebecca in a way that didn't feel like coincidence. At first, Rebecca pushed the thoughts aside. She tried to convince herself she was imagining things. James was probably stressed from work, and Sarah was still adjusting to life in Baton Rouge. But the nagging feeling in her chest wouldn't go away. Something wasn't right, and Rebecca knew it. One morning, while cleaning the kitchen, Rebecca noticed James's briefcase sitting on the counter. She hesitated for a moment before opening it, curiosity tugging at her. Inside, tucked between some papers, was a small receipt. She unfolded it carefully, her hands trembling. It was from a motel dated just a few days earlier. Her stomach dropped. The world around her seemed to shift, the walls closing in. She stared at the receipt, the truth sinking in. James hadn't been working late or stuck in traffic. He had been at a motel, but Rebecca didn't confront him, not yet. She needed more proof. Something told her this was just the beginning of the story. From that moment, Rebecca became an observer in her own home. She watched James and Sarah closely, her eyes catching every interaction. The way James's hand would linger on Sarah's arm just a little too long, the way Sarah's cheeks would flush whenever he spoke to her, it all became painfully clear. Rebecca started replaying past moments in her mind, moments she had brushed off as harmless, like when James had laughed a little too loudly at Sarah's jokes, or how Sarah would always find a way to sit next to him at dinner. Now, those memories felt like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't unsee. One evening, as Rebecca sat on the couch pretending to read a book, she glanced at James and Sarah across the room. James leaned toward Sarah, his voice soft and low, a smile playing on his lips. Sarah's face turned red as she glanced nervously at Rebecca. And then Rebecca knew. The realization hit her like a blow to the chest. Her husband and her sister were having an affair. The betrayal cut her deeply. She felt a mix of emotions she couldn't untangle: anger, heartbreak, disbelief. The two people she trusted most had destroyed her world. Rebecca wanted to confront them, to scream and demand answers, but she didn't. Instead, she chose a different path. She would wait. She would plan. Her heartbreak began to harden into something else, something colder. Every stolen glance between James and Sarah, every whisper and laugh, only fueled her determination. They thought they were being careful, but Rebecca saw it all. She kept her pain hidden, her face calm and unreadable. James and Sarah had no idea. They were being watched. They thought they were safe. But Rebecca had a plan. She didn't know exactly what she would do, but she knew one thing for sure: James and Sarah would regret betraying her. And when the time came, they wouldn't see it coming. The morning heat hung heavy in the air, filling the Thornton home with an oppressive stillness. Rebecca wandered into the kitchen, her mind swirling with unease she couldn't quite name. She moved to tidy up, hoping the routine would settle her nerves. That's when she saw it. James's phone sitting on the counter. It wasn't like him to leave his phone behind. James was always so careful, so precise. Rebecca's heart skipped a beat. She stared at it for a moment, her instinct warning her against what she was about to do. But the nagging doubts that had been creeping into her mind for weeks were impossible to ignore. Her fingers hovered over the screen before she finally unlocked it. At first, everything seemed normal: work emails, texts from colleagues, nothing out of place. But then she saw a string of messages from someone labeled as Sarah's friend. Her stomach turned. As she opened the thread, her worst fears were confirmed. The messages weren't just casual, they were intimate, passionate, and unmistakably clear. The words on the screen spoke of secret meetings, stolen kisses, and whispered promises. They weren't just from any random contact. They were from Sarah. Rebecca's hands began to shake, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Each message felt like a blow, shattering any illusion she'd held on to. She had suspected something was wrong, but seeing the evidence made her feel like the ground beneath her had disappeared. Unable to contain her emotions, Rebecca stormed down the hallway, gripping the phone like a weapon. She threw open Sarah's bedroom door, her voice trembling with fury. "How could you do this to me?" she demanded, holding up the phone. "You're my sister." Sarah, startled awake, sat up in bed. Her face turned pale as she saw Rebecca's expression and the phone in her hand. She stammered, searching for words. "Rebecca, I didn't mean for this to happen. I'm so sorry." "Sorry?" Rebecca's voice cracked as the tears came. "You betrayed me with my husband. You didn't just hurt me, you destroyed me." Sarah's apologies only fueled Rebecca's anger. The argument escalated quickly, years of buried tension between the sisters erupting all at once. "You've always been jealous of me," Rebecca accused, her voice rising. "Always trying to take what's mine, but this is unforgivable." "It wasn't like that," Sarah cried. "I didn't plan this, Rebecca. It just happened. I never wanted to hurt you." But Rebecca wasn't hearing her anymore. The pain in her chest was too great, the betrayal too raw. Sarah, the person she had trusted most, had destroyed the one thing Rebecca thought she could count on her marriage. Later that evening, James came home to find Rebecca waiting for him in the living room. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. She held the phone in her hand, the damning messages still open. "What is this?" she asked, her voice eerily calm. James froze when he saw the phone. He tried to explain, his words fumbling as he searched for a way out. "Rebecca, it's not what it looks like." "Not what it looks like?" Rebecca's voice rose, shaking with emotion. "You betrayed me with my own sister, James. How could you?" He tried to reach for her hand, but she pulled away. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but her anger burned brighter than her pain. "I trusted you," she said, her voice breaking. "I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me?" James tried to apologize, but every word felt hollow. The man who had once been her partner now seemed like a stranger. Rebecca could hardly bear to look at him. In the days that followed, the tension in the house became unbearable. James and Sarah avoided Rebecca, their guilt evident in every glance. But Rebecca was no longer just heartbroken. She was cold, calculating, and determined. She wasn't going to let them get away with what they had done. They had shattered her life, and Rebecca vowed to make them feel the pain she carried. The perfect family facade had been ripped away, and what lay beneath was broken beyond repair. But Rebecca wasn't finished. She was just getting started. Rebecca's pain turned into something colder, something calculated. She no longer cried or raged openly. Instead, she planned. If she was going to make James and Sarah pay, she knew she had to be patient, careful, and deliberate. To James, she pretended to forgive. "I want us to work through this," she told him one evening, her voice steady, but her eyes glinting with hidden resolve. James, desperate to believe that the worst was over, eagerly accepted her offer of reconciliation. He wanted to move past the affair and rebuild his life, oblivious to the trap Rebecca was setting. To Sarah, Rebecca offered what seemed like a heartfelt gesture of peace. "You're my sister. I know things got messy, but we can't let this destroy our bond," she said, her tone soft and kind. Sarah, already drowning in guilt, clung to Rebecca's apparent willingness to mend their relationship. She wanted to believe her sister could forgive her, but Rebecca's every word, every action was part of her plan. Behind the mask of forgiveness, she began to observe them both closely, keeping mental notes of their routines and lies. She catalogued their movements, the times James would work late, or Sarah would disappear without explanation. Each detail became another piece of the puzzle she was putting together for her ultimate act of revenge. By late August, Rebecca was ready. She decided it was time to set her plan into motion. She invited Sarah over for what she called a heart-to-heart. Her words were laced with warmth, her smile welcoming. "We need to talk. I think it's time we cleared the air," she said. Sarah, hopeful that they could repair their fractured bond, agreed without hesitation. The day of the meeting was hot and still, the summer heat pressing down like a weight. Rebecca spent the morning preparing. She arranged the living room carefully, setting out refreshments and dimming the lights to create a cozy, inviting atmosphere. Soft music played in the background, masking the tension that churned inside her. Everything was designed to make Sarah feel at ease. When Sarah arrived, Rebecca greeted her with open arms. "Thank you for coming," she said warmly, leading her sister to the couch. They sat across from one another, Rebecca projecting an air of calm that belied her true intentions. At first, the conversation was light. Rebecca spoke about family and forgiveness, weaving a story of understanding and healing. Sarah, desperate for things to return to normal, let her guard down. She began to apologize again, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I'm so sorry for everything, Rebecca," she said, her voice trembling. But as Sarah poured her heart out, Rebecca's demeanor began to shift. Her voice grew colder, her words sharper. "You didn't just make a mistake, Sarah. You destroyed my life," Rebecca said, her calm mask slipping. Sarah looked up, alarm flashing in her eyes. "I didn't mean to," Rebecca cut her off. "Didn't mean to. You betrayed me. You took everything that mattered to me and threw it away for your selfishness." The air in the room grew heavy. Sarah tried to speak, but her words faltered under Rebecca's rising anger. Rebecca stood abruptly, her movements quick and deliberate. "You ruined my marriage, my family, everything I built," she shouted, her voice trembling with fury. Sarah backed away, her face pale. "Rebecca, please, I know I was wrong. I'll leave. I'll never bother you again. Just let me fix this," she begged, her voice shaking. But Rebecca didn't hear her. Months of pain and betrayal had built to this moment, and now it was all spilling out. Her eyes landed on a hammer that sat nearby, something she had deliberately placed there earlier. Without thinking, driven by a storm of rage and heartbreak, she grabbed it. In a flash, Rebecca swung the hammer. The impact was swift and brutal, and Sarah collapsed to the floor. Her wide eyes stared up at Rebecca, full of shock, before closing forever. Rebecca stood frozen, the hammer still in her hand. The soft music played on in the background, a cruel contrast to the horror of what had just happened. The room was eerily quiet now, the only sound Rebecca's shallow, rapid breathing. As the adrenaline drained from her body, the weight of what she had done began to settle. Her revenge had been carried out, but the cost of her actions was just beginning to unfold. For weeks, Rebecca pretended everything was fine. She told James that Sarah had left town to clear her head. "She just needs some time to figure things out," she said calmly, trying to reassure him. James accepted it at first, though unease lingered. But as the days turned into weeks, Sarah's silence became impossible to ignore. She had always stayed in touch, even during her lowest moments. Now her phone calls and texts had stopped completely. James tried reaching out, calling her repeatedly, but there was no answer. Her social media was silent too, with no updates or posts. The emptiness gnawed at him, and worry turned into dread. Finally, James couldn't ignore it any longer. He went to the police and reported Sarah missing. The investigation began with quiet questions. Detectives asked James and Rebecca about Sarah's habits, her state of mind, and any reason she might have had for disappearing. Rebecca played the role of the concerned sister perfectly, her words measured and her emotions carefully controlled. "She's been going through a lot," Rebecca said softly, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "I just hope she's safe wherever she is." James, on the other hand, couldn't hide his growing anxiety. He told the officers everything he knew, his suspicions, the strained dynamics in the house, and how Sarah's absence felt wrong. The police interviewed neighbors, checked Sarah's usual haunts, and searched for signs of her leaving, but nothing pointed to where she could be. Neighbors hadn't seen her leave, and surveillance footage showed no sign of her car departing. Frustration mounted as the investigation stalled. Then the police decided to search the Thornton home thoroughly, leaving no corner unchecked. Rebecca watched as the officers combed through the house. She kept her face calm, but her hands clenched tightly, betraying her tension. When they moved to the basement, She tried to distract them with idle chatter, but they were determined. The basement was dimly lit and cluttered with old boxes and forgotten items. One officer moved a stack of boxes and uncovered a tarp. Beneath, it lay Sarah's lifeless body. The room went silent as the officers processed the horrifying discovery. James, who had been standing nearby, froze in disbelief. His breath caught in his throat as he stared at the pale figure of the woman he once cared for. "She's been here the whole time," an officer murmured, shaking his head. James felt the walls close in. His mind struggled to make sense of it. Sarah hadn't disappeared. She hadn't run away. She had been right there in the house, hidden in the shadows of their lives. Rebecca's carefully crafted lie began to unravel. At first, Rebecca tried to maintain her composure. She denied knowing anything about Sarah's death, insisting she was as shocked as everyone else, but the police weren't convinced. As the evidence mounted and the interrogations grew more intense, Rebecca's facade cracked. Her voice wavered, her hands shook, and finally, the truth spilled out. Through tears, Rebecca confessed everything. She spoke about the rage that had consumed her, the betrayal that had broken her heart, and the moment she lost control. She admitted to killing Sarah in a heated confrontation, unable to contain the emotions that had been building for weeks. "I didn't plan it," she said, her voice trembling. "It just happened. I was so angry, so hurt, I couldn't stop myself." The weight of her confession filled the room, leaving everyone stunned. For James, the truth was a devastating blow. The wife he thought he knew had been hiding a dark secret. The sister-in-law he had betrayed was gone forever, and the home that once symbolized his success and stability had become a place of tragedy. The Thornton family would never be the same. Their lives were shattered, and the scars of that summer would haunt them forever. James Thornton walked out of custody a free man, but his freedom came at a heavy price. His life in Baton Rouge was shattered beyond repair. The whispers, the judgmental glances, and the pity-filled looks from those who had once admired him were unbearable. He packed up his belongings, left the city, and tried to start fresh in a place where no one knew his name. But no matter how far he traveled, he couldn't escape the memories. The betrayal, the lies, and the tragedy of that summer haunted him. Guilt settled into his bones, a constant reminder of the choices that led to the unraveling of his family. Rebecca's life was reduced to the cold walls of a prison cell. Once celebrated for her grace and poise, she now spent her days in silence, her past weighing heavily on her shoulders. The time she had so carefully filled with planning and plotting was now endless, empty, and unforgiving. Each night, as the prison grew quiet, Rebecca relived the moment she took Sarah's life. She thought of her sister's face, of the rage that consumed her, and of the love and trust she had destroyed. No amount of time could erase the scars of her actions, and no reflection could bring Sarah back. The house they once called home now stood as a chilling reminder of their downfall. Its grand appearance couldn't mask the emptiness inside. The garden Rebecca once tended was overgrown, and the windows that used to glow warmly at night now stared blankly into the street. Neighbors walked past quickly, avoiding the sight of the house where tragedy had struck. What was once a symbol of success and family had become a ghost of its former self. It stood there, quiet and forgotten, much like the lives it had contained. The story of the Thorntons spread beyond Baton Rouge. It became a cautionary tale whispered at dinner tables and shared as a warning about the dangers of betrayal and unchecked emotions. Their downfall was proof of how even the strongest foundations could crumble when trust was broken and love turned into anger. In the end, the Thorntons were not remembered for their wealth or their success, but for the tragic legacy of a family, torn apart. The story of the Thornton family is one of love, betrayal, and the devastating consequences of choices left unchecked. James and Rebecca had built a life that looked perfect from the outside, but beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Sarah's arrival acted as a spark that ignited hidden desires and unleashed emotions that none of them could control, but started as an affair, fueled by passion and secrecy, quickly spiraled into a tragedy that shattered their lives. James lost everything: the trust of his wife, his reputation, and the life he had worked so hard to build. Rebecca's heartbreak turned into rage, leading her to commit an irreversible act that landed her behind bars. And Sarah's life ended, far too soon, a victim of the tangled web of betrayal and jealousy. This story leaves us with questions that are difficult to answer. Could things have been different if they had faced their issues honestly? Were the betrayals and lies inevitable, or were they choices that could have been avoided? The Thornton home, once a symbol of success and stability, now stands empty, a silent reminder of the tragedy that unfolded within its walls. It's a cautionary tale of how unchecked emotions and hidden secrets can destroy even the strongest foundations. What do you think about this story? Could you have seen this ending coming? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy exploring stories that reveal the darker corners of human nature and the consequences of our choices, make sure to subscribe to our channel. More unforgettable stories are waiting to be told.